In April 2025, Bill Maher walked into the White House carrying a bet almost no one else in American comedy was willing to make. He sat down across from Donald Trump, shared a meal that also included Kid Rock, and later told his audience that the president had been gracious and measured, words that stood in sharp contrast to the persona Maher had spent years dissecting on real time. It was not a stunt designed for clips. Maher framed the evening as a genuine act of political engagement. If the president absorbed information through private conversations more than through briefings or hostile interviews, then someone willing to say difficult things should be in the room. At the same time, he added a careful distinction that would later define the entire 15-month arc. It does not matter who Trump is across a dinner table with a comedian. It matters who he is when he exercises power on the world stage. That dual framing, private openness on one side, public record on the other, was unusually generous. Most people who have ever worked near someone they politically oppose have encountered some version of the split between personal demeanor and official conduct. Extending that framework to a figure as singularly focused on loyalty and personal grievance as Trump was always a high-risk proposition. Maher made the wager anyway. The cost arrived almost immediately and from his own side. Larry David, a friend of nearly 2 decades, responded with a satirical New York Times essay titled My Dinner with Adolf. The piece imagined a similarly warm private account of a meal with a young Hitler and carried the unmistakable suggestion that private charm says nothing meaningful about public danger. The friendship, by Maher's own later account, never fully recovered. Other peers were equally unimpressed. Sean Penn reportedly could not understand why private likability was being given such weight. Large segments of Maher's audience revolted. He dismissed some of the departing viewers as idiots and refused to retract the original description. For almost a year, the story existed in a tense, unresolved middle distance. Maher continued to criticize Trump's policies while defending the principle of direct engagement. Trump, for a time, left the dinner largely unmentioned. The experiment appeared, if not successful, at least unfinished. Then the goodwill was revoked. On February 14, 2026, Trump returned to the subject with a Truth Social post that discarded every trace of the previous spring's warmth. He called Maher a highly overrated lightweight. He declared the White House dinner a complete waste of time. And then he delivered the comparison designed to cut deepest. Maher was no different than Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, or Stephen Colbert. For a comedian who had spent years constructing a brand around being more willing to engage serious conservative arguments than the rest of late-night television, the grouping was a deliberate erasure. Maher had not built recurring segments around nightly mockery. He had accepted an invitation most of his peers would have refused on principle, sat across the table in the White House, and come away prepared to separate private demeanor from public record. Whatever the limits of that distinction, it required a level of generosity none of the 3 hosts named in the post had extended. Trump's response was to collapse the distinction entirely and treat the dinner as if it had conferred no standing whatsoever. The mechanics of the insult revealed something larger about how this president handles even those who have gone out of their way to treat him more charitably than the rest of their industry. Goodwill does not appear to accumulate into lasting credit. It can be withdrawn retroactively and without explanation the moment it becomes politically useful to withdraw it. The man who had been described as gracious and measured was now, in the same voice, indistinguishable from the hosts who had never given him the benefit of a private conversation. Maher did not let the post pass in silence. The response that followed would attempt something rarer than simple retaliation, an actual public ledger. On the March 6, 2026 broadcast of Real Time, during the New Rules segment, Maher answered the insult with a carefully constructed accounting that refused the clean narrative both his supporters and his critics preferred. He opened by turning Trump's preferred style of attack back on him, arguing that the president was the one suffering from Bill Maher derangement syndrome and asserting the right to say so in a democracy. Then he did something almost no one else in the Trump-era comedy landscape had been willing to do in public. He itemized. On the credit side of the ledger, he gave Trump specific, named praise. He called the border a win. He supported the deportation of violent criminal gang members as a policy that had driven real electoral support. He backed the strike on Iran's nuclear facilities. He supported the military operation that removed Nicolas Maduro from power in Venezuela. He agreed that demanding NATO members pay a larger share of defense costs was not wrong. He credited Trump for explicitly rejecting Nick Fuentes and the anti-Semitic faction inside the broader coalition with the words, "We don't want you." He even conceded that one of his own predictions, economic collapse by the 4th of July, had been incorrect. On the debit side, the list was longer and equally concrete. He condemned what he called the sadism and stupidity surrounding certain immigration enforcement practices. He described the Department of Government Efficiency initiative as a complete disaster that produced unnecessary harm without delivering meaningful reductions in waste. He mocked the administration's promotion of coal. He criticized the pattern of favoring foreign autocrats over long-standing democratic allies. He called out the juvenile trolling and the use of lawsuits to silence dissenters. He condemned the ongoing obsession with election denial, and he criticized a governing style of pardons for friends and punishment for enemies. This was not the segment of a man stubbornly defending a social mistake. It was an attempt at genuine double-entry bookkeeping in an environment that rewards only one-sided ledgers. Most public commentary on Trump sorts cleanly into sustained admiration or sustained condemnation. Maher's segment did neither. That structural refusal is precisely why it was harder to dismiss as partisan reflex, and why the original insult had tried to flatten him back into the same undifferentiated category as the purely critical hosts. Whether the balance of the ledger was correct is a separate argument. The fact that he was willing to keep one at all, in public, after being publicly humiliated for the dinner, remains one of the more unusual choices in the entire Trump-era comedy record. The months that followed confirmed a shape that should have been recognizable to anyone who had watched Trump's other relationships with people who once offered him goodwill. Warmth is extended. Some form of independence or criticism eventually appears. The warmth is withdrawn and replaced by the same register of insult used against everyone else. By July 2026, in an interview with NPR, Maher offered his most unfiltered psychological assessment yet. He said Trump has a form of Tourette's in the sense that he blurts out whatever is currently in his mind, often without the ordinary social filters. He then produced a contradictory formulation that tried to capture something genuinely difficult to categorize. Trump is simultaneously the most full-of-it person and also the most honest. The apparent paradox points at a real phenomenon, a public figure whose specific factual claims are frequently false while still managing to communicate an underlying attitude or grievance that a significant portion of the country experiences as authentic. Pressed on why he continued to defend the value of direct engagement, Maher argued that Trump does look people in the eye, does listen in private, and does change his mind at times, largely because he appears to hold no fixed beliefs. The observation is double-edged. A capacity to be persuaded can also mean the absence of any stable convictions that survived the last conversation. He acknowledged the core failure of the original framing. He had presented the dinner as a Nixon to China moment, direct contact across a deep political divide that might produce lasting change. What it actually produced was a pleasant evening, a cascade of criticism from his own side, a fractured friendship with Larry David that still had not healed, and eventually public treatment from Trump that looked almost identical to the treatment given to critics who had never accepted a White House invitation at all. That quiet admission is more damning than any single insult either man threw. The historical analogy had been chosen because the original Nixon opening produced a durable policy shift. Maher's dinner produced no comparable shift in how Trump spoke about him or treated him once the private conversation ended. By his own account, he received a civil evening and a significant personal cost in exchange for no lasting alteration in the public relationship. What separates the Bill Maher saga from the long list of Trump's celebrity conflicts is that it did not begin with an insult or a monologue. It began with an experiment. One prominent comedian wagered that a shared meal, a willingness to describe a political opponent's private demeanor in positive terms, and a subsequent public attempt at fair-minded accounting might achieve something that pure hostility never could. He accepted personal and professional risk from his own audience and his own friends in order to test the proposition. 15 months later, the ledger is badly unbalanced. Maher can point to a civil evening, a set of private impressions about attentiveness and relative self-awareness, and his own ongoing belief that engagement is preferable to permanent refusal as a matter of principle. What he cannot point to is evidence that the dinner altered a single policy trajectory, prevented a single later attack, or purchased durable standing with an administration whose documented pattern is to treat even mild or carefully qualified criticism as sufficient grounds for retaliation. He offered more public generosity and more structured attempt at balanced evaluation than almost any other entertainer of comparable stature. The return on that investment was a meal, a prolonged controversy that damaged a two-decade friendship, sustained criticism from people who shared his broader politics, and in the end, the identical category of insults Trump applies to people who never extended any goodwill, overrated, lightweight, waste of time, indistinguishable from the rest. The pattern is not unique to Maher. It appears across dozens of documented relationships in which temporary warmth or tactical cooperation was extended and then revoked the moment the other party asserted any independence. If the single most deliberate good faith effort at personal engagement this presidency received from a major cultural figure produced nothing more lasting than a dinner and a delayed return to hostility, it becomes difficult to argue that a better calibrated version of the same approach would have yielded a meaningfully different result. There may simply be no stable version of engagement with this particular president. However sincere the initial gesture, however carefully the subsequent criticism is balanced, however genuine the attempt to separate private demeanor from public record, that does not eventually collapse into the same public register of grievance and insult that defines nearly every other relationship he has maintained with anyone willing to criticize him at all. The dinner was intended to open a different kind of space. 15 months of evidence suggests the space was never available to be held open. Warmth was offered, independence was eventually expressed, the warmth was withdrawn without remainder, and the relationship returned to the only mode that appears durable once the compliments stop, volume, categorization with the enemy camp, and the insistence that no one who crossed the line was ever truly different from the others. That is the record the experiment left behind. By the summer of 2026, the original wager Maher had made in the White House dining room had been tested long enough to yield a clear result. The dinner had been offered as proof that personal contact could create a different kind of relationship with Donald Trump, one in which private civility might translate into some measure of public restraint, or at least into a more complicated public accounting. 15 months later, that translation had not occurred. What had occurred instead was a near-perfect demonstration of the opposite pattern. Warmth extended, independence eventually asserted, warmth revoked, and the relationship restored to the same register of insult used against people who had never offered any warmth at all. Bill Maher continued to insist that the private man he had met was more self-aware and less belligerent than the public performer. He continued to argue that direct engagement was better than permanent refusal on principle. He continued to keep a public ledger that gave Trump specific credit on border enforcement, certain military actions, NATO spending pressure, and the rejection of the most extreme anti-Semitic voices inside the broader coalition, while simultaneously cataloging the failures, the cruelty, the trolling, the lawsuits, and the governing style of reward and punishment. None of that accounting purchased durability. When Trump decided the association was no longer useful or flattering, the earlier description of gracious and measured was replaced without remainder by highly overrated, lightweight, and no different than Kimmel, Fallon, or Colbert. The speed and completeness of the reversal mattered. Maher had not spent the intervening year running nightly segments of pure mockery. He had accepted social and professional costs from his own audience and from long-standing friends, including the still unrepaired rupture with Larry David, in order to defend the legitimacy of the original conversation. Trump's February post treated that entire investment as irrelevant. The distinction Maher had tried to maintain between himself and the rest of late-night television was erased in a single sentence. The goodwill was not merely discontinued, it was retroactively nullified. That nullification revealed something structural about how this president processes even temporary allies. Credit does not appear to bank. A civil evening, a public compliment, a willingness to separate private demeanor from public record, none of it functions as lasting equity. The moment the other party asserts an independent judgment that is less than fully supportive, the prior warmth becomes evidence of the other party's naivety or weakness, rather than evidence of the president's capacity for reciprocity. Maher had tested the proposition as carefully as almost any prominent cultural figure had dared. The result was indistinguishable from the results obtained by people who had never tested it. The larger environment in which the personal saga continued only sharpened the point. While the 15-month argument with a comedian occupied recurring space in the public conversation, the same White House was managing an active and highly volatile confrontation with Iran. A situation in which a single mischaracterized statement about whether direct talks were underway could destabilize delicate indirect negotiations, and in which threats of decapitation sat in the same news cycle as claims that a major deal was imminent. The juxtaposition was not accidental. It illustrated the same underlying difficulty: finite presidential attention divided between genuine high-stakes statecraft and the maintenance of personal grievance ledgers that, by any ordinary measure, should have been closed after a single evening. Maher's own later reflections contained the quiet concession that completed the arc. He had framed the dinner as a Nixon to China opening. The historical analogy was chosen because that earlier opening produced a durable shift in the relationship between long-standing adversaries. His dinner produced no comparable shift. Trump did not moderate his public posture toward Maher over time. He did not treat the earlier goodwill as a standing reason for restraint. When it became convenient to reclassify the comedian, he did so in the same vocabulary he uses for every other critic. By Maher's own account, the experiment yielded a pleasant meal, a set of private impressions, significant personal and professional cost, and no lasting alteration in the public terms of the relationship. That is the record the 15 months left behind. An unusually deliberate attempt at good faith engagement was met after a delay with the identical form of dismissal used against people who never engaged. The private distinction between the man at the table and the man on the stage proved non-transferable to the public arena. The ledger Maher tried to keep in public, specific credits alongside specific debits, did not protect him from being flattened back into the undifferentiated category of enemy once the president decided the association no longer served. And the friendship that was damaged in the original defense of the dinner remained damaged long after the strategic rationale for the dinner had collapsed. The experiment was not without value as evidence. It demonstrated, under relatively clean conditions, the narrow limits of personal contact as a tool for altering this particular president's public behavior toward critics. Warmth can be offered. It can even be temporarily reciprocated in private. It does not reliably survive the first moment the other party says something the president finds inconvenient or insufficiently admiring. When that moment arrives, the prior warmth is not weighed in the balance. It is simply discarded. Maher gave the proposition a more serious and more costly test than most of his peers were willing to attempt. The outcome suggests that the limitation was never in the calibration of the approach. The limitation was in the nature of the relationship being attempted. The dinner had been meant to open a different kind of space. The 15 months that followed showed that the space could not be held. By the time the full 15 months could be viewed as a single continuous record, the Bill Maher experiment had stopped looking like an unfinished conversation and started looking like a completed demonstration. The original wager had been straightforward in its ambition and unusually costly in its execution. Bill Maher had accepted a White House dinner invitation that most of his peers would have rejected on principle. He had sat across from Donald Trump, experienced a version of the man that felt more attentive and less performatively hostile than the public persona, and then told a national audience that the private encounter revealed someone gracious and measured. He had tried to hold two ideas at once, that private demeanor and public record are not identical, and that direct engagement might still be worth the risk even when the public record remained deeply troubling. He had paid for that framing immediately and heavily in the rupture with Larry David and the alienation of significant parts of his own audience, and in the sustained skepticism of peers who saw the entire premise as a category error. For a time, it was possible to argue that the experiment remained open. Trump did not immediately convert the dinner into a public attack. Maher continued to criticize policy while defending the legitimacy of having taken the meeting. The ledger he later produced on air, specific credits on border enforcement, certain military actions, NATO pressure, and the rejection of the most toxic anti-Semitic voices, paired with equally specific debits on enforcement cruelty, institutional damage, autocrat favoritism, lawfare against critics, and the governing style of selective mercy and selective punishment, represented a genuine attempt to keep the accounting honest rather than tribal. In a media environment that rewards only one-sided narratives, the decision to keep a double entry book was itself a form of stubborn independence. None of it proved transferable. When Trump decided the association no longer suited him, the prior warmth was not weighed against the subsequent criticism. It was simply erased. The February 2026 Post did not argue with Maher's ledger. It did not engage the distinction between private and public. It collapsed the comedian back into the same undifferentiated category as the hosts who had never offered any private goodwill at all. Highly overrated lightweight. Complete waste of time. No different than Kimmel, Fallon, or Colbert. The sentence that grouped Maher with the rest of late night was the functional equivalent of a ledger reset. Everything that had been extended in the dining room and defended in the months afterward was treated as if it had never conferred standing. That reset is the detail that gives the saga its lasting diagnostic value. Maher had tested the proposition under relatively favorable conditions. He had not spent the intervening year running pure attack segments. He had absorbed real social and professional costs from his own side in order to keep the channel of engagement open. He had continued to offer specific praise where he believed it was due even after the public relationship deteriorated. If credit were capable of accumulating with this president, some residue of that investment should have remained visible. Instead, the revocation was total. The earlier description of gracious and measured retained no protective force once the president preferred the simpler classification of enemy. The surrounding context only sharpened the demonstration. While the personal grievance with a comedian continued to occupy recurring space in the public conversation, the same administration was managing an extraordinarily volatile confrontation with Iran. A situation in which competing public claims about whether direct negotiations were even occurring could themselves become destabilizing, and in which maximalist threats sat in the same news cycle as assertions that a major agreement was imminent. The juxtaposition illustrated the same underlying scarcity. Presidential attention is finite, and every sustained investment in a retrospective personal ledger is an investment not made in the present tense variables of statecraft. The Maher conflict was never the most consequential matter on the agenda. Its persistence alongside matters that were consequential made the opportunity cost visible. Maher's own later comments contained the concession that closed the logical circle. He had reached for the Nixon to China analogy because that historical opening produced a durable shift in a previously frozen relationship. His dinner produced no equivalent shift. Trump did not begin treating him with lasting restraint. He did not grant the earlier goodwill any standing once criticism resumed. When it became useful to reclassify the comedian, the reclassification was executed in the identical vocabulary applied to people who had never sat at the table. By Maher's own description, the experiment yielded a civil evening, a set of private impressions about relative self-awareness, significant personal damage, including a friendship that still had not healed, and no enduring alteration in the public terms of engagement. That is the completed record. An unusually deliberate, unusually costly attempt at good faith contact was met after a delay with the same form of dismissal used against those who never attempted contact. The private distinction between the man at dinner and the man on the stage proved non-portable. The public ledger of specific credits and debits offered no insulation once the president preferred a simpler binary. And the personal relationships damaged in the original defense of the dinner remained damaged after the strategic rationale for the dinner had collapsed. The experiment retains value as evidence precisely because it was conducted as cleanly as the environment allowed. It was not a drive-by insult answered by a reciprocal insult. It was a sustained, documented effort to test whether personal proximity and calibrated public fairness could produce a different kind of relationship with this particular president. The result suggests the limitation was never primarily in the tone or the balance of the approach. The limitation was in the nature of the reciprocity available on the other side. Warmth can be performed in private. It does not reliably convert into standing that survives the first independent judgment the other party finds inconvenient. Maher gave the hypothesis a more serious trial than most of his contemporaries were willing to risk. The 15-month record indicates that the hypothesis failed, not because the dinner was insufficiently gracious, and not because the subsequent criticism was insufficiently balanced, but because the underlying pattern does not appear to contain a stable category for the generous critic. There is the loyalist and there is the enemy. Temporary occupancy of a third space is possible. Permanent residence in it is not. The dinner was intended to prove that a different space could be held open. The months that followed showed that the space collapses the moment it is tested by disagreement. Warmth was extended. Independence was eventually expressed. The warmth was withdrawn without residual credit, and the relationship returned to the only durable mode this presidency has demonstrated with those who criticize it: categorical dismissal, retrospective nullification of prior goodwill, and the insistence that no one who crossed the line was ever meaningfully different from the rest. That is the final accounting the experiment produced. It is not a story about one dinner. It is a story about the narrow limits of engagement itself. When the full arc is examined without sentimentality, the Bill Maher dinner stops looking like a missed opportunity and starts looking like a controlled demonstration of limits. The hypothesis being tested was simple and, in another political era, might even have seemed reasonable. Direct personal contact with Donald Trump, combined with a public willingness to separate private demeanor from public record, and to keep a balanced ledger of specific praises and specific criticisms, might create a different kind of relationship, one less purely adversarial than the default posture of late-night comedy and cable confrontation. Bill Maher gave that hypothesis a more serious and more expensive trial than almost any peer of comparable stature. He accepted the invitation. He described the evening in positive terms. He absorbed the immediate social and professional costs from his own side, including the lasting damage to his friendship with Larry David. He continued, even after the relationship deteriorated, to itemize both credits and debits in public rather than retreat into pure condemnation. The result was not a modified relationship. The result was a delayed but complete reversion to the standard pattern. Trump's February 2026 post did not debate the content of Maher's ledger. It did not acknowledge the distinction Maher had tried to maintain between himself and the hosts who never engaged. It simply erased the prior category and reinserted Maher into the general population of critics. Highly overrated, lightweight, complete waste of time. No different than Kimmel, Fallon, or Colbert. The language performed a reset. Everything that had been extended in the dining room and defended in the months afterward was treated as non-transferable and non-binding. Credit did not carry forward. Goodwill did not accumulate. The private impression of a more self-aware and less belligerent man conferred no lasting public standing once criticism resumed that reset is the central finding of the experiment. If reciprocity of any durable kind were available, some residue of the original investment should have remained visible after 15 months of relatively restrained and occasionally even-handed public commentary from Maher. Instead, the revocation was total and retrospective. The earlier description of gracious and measured retained no protective or moderating force. When the president preferred the simpler classification was imposed without remainder. The broader environment in which this personal sequence unfolded only made the demonstration clearer. The 15-month record indicates that the hypothesis failed, not because the dinner was insufficiently gracious, and not because the subsequent criticism was insufficiently balanced, but because the underlying pattern does not appear to contain a stable category for the generous critic. There is the loyalist and there is the enemy. Temporary occupancy of a third space is possible. Permanent residence in it is not. The dinner was intended to prove that a different space could be held open. The months that followed showed that the space collapses the moment it is tested by disagreement. Warmth was extended. Independence was eventually expressed. The warmth was withdrawn without residual credit. And the relationship returned to the only durable mode this presidency has demonstrated with those who criticize it: categorical dismissal, retrospective nullification of prior goodwill, and the insistence that no one who crossed the line was ever meaningfully different from the rest. That is the final accounting the experiment produced. It is not a story about one dinner. It is a story about the narrow limits of engagement itself. When the full arc is examined without sentimentality, the Bill Maher dinner stops looking like a missed opportunity and starts looking like a controlled demonstration of limits. The hypothesis being tested was simple and, in another political era, might even have seemed reasonable. Direct personal contact with Donald Trump, combined with a public willingness to separate private demeanor from public record, and to keep a balanced ledger of specific praises and specific criticisms, might create a different kind of relationship, one less purely adversarial than the default posture of late-night comedy and cable confrontation. Bill Maher gave that hypothesis a more serious and more expensive trial than almost any peer of comparable stature. And to keep a balanced ledger of specific praises and specific criticisms might create a different kind of relationship, one less purely adversarial than the default posture of late-night comedy and cable confrontation. Bill Maher gave that hypothesis a more serious and more expensive trial than almost any peer of comparable stature. And to keep a balanced ledger of specific